Good people of DOCAM', I greet you. I'm very sorry that I cannot be with you today. My year has turned out to be something quite different than I expected. So instead I'm sitting here in the beautiful Teleborg Castle, which is situated on the campus of Linnaeus University. And those of you who attended the 2011 conference know exactly where I'm sitting. I'm sitting in the very room where we had our lunches. And today I want to speak to you about a topic that concerns a project that I'm currently working on. And the title of this presentation is Documentality as Inscribed Act, Ontology, Technology and Practice of Professional Codes of Ethics in Librarianship. That is basically what we're looking at in this project. The project has two angles that is studied. One is the actual ethics of librarianship, and one might ask why that is interesting to look at. The point of departure that we have is a fairly simple one. This is one of the oldest occupations in the world. We have had libraries and librarians for as long as we have had civilization. And it's among what one might define as the original professions of society. However, it is strangely unregulated compared to other professions of the same age and character. Name, for example, the medical professions, physicians, nurses. We can also mention lawyers, for instance. They all have very strong ethical codes that direct their work from bottoms up, basically. Librarians do not. And that was one of the main points of departure for this project that we wanted to study, because it's still librarians, there is no lack of ethical codes, but they haven't really had the same kind of performative status as they have had in several other comparable professions. And we wanted to know why is that, and in what way has the ethical codes of librarian actually changed. And when we discussed this, my colleagues and me, we thought of how should we enter this problem of the ethics of librarianship in a constructive way which focuses specific documentary aspects of this. And so we searched around the literature and fell into the concept of documentality. Now, documentality, to have a documentality perspective or a documentalist perspective on ethical codes is, of course, a way which is typical of LIS people to do. And the term documentality is by no means a stranger in the DOCAM' society, in the DOCAM' community. We can say, of course, that it's very much at the center of what we do in document research. And most of you in the room right now have a fairly good idea of what we mean with documentality as a fundamental concept. So I will not go into a deeper examination here of the different varieties or versions of understandings of documentality. Instead, I will just focus on the one that we found being suitable for this project studying the ethics of librarianship. Documentality is a very fluid term, and we stumbled across, actually, the Italian philosopher Maurizio Ferraris, who has written a book which is pretty much pins down the essence of documentality as far as I'm concerned, and I highly recommend that for reading. The book is called Documentality, Why It's Necessary to Leave Traces. Now, Ferraris is a philosopher, and he writes books like philosophers do. He takes 300 pages to perform an argument, but when he does come to the conclusion, he has a fairly strong argument. What he says is that documents does things to reality. They are not just products of society, but they construct society. Now that is nothing new. The thing with Ferraris is that he is very much acquainted and very much linked with postmodern thought and thinkers like, for instance, Jacques Derrida, whom he obviously knows. He has written books together with him. He has interviewed Derrida several times, and the whole concept of documentality is somewhat formulated in relation and sometimes in opposition to the very language-focused philosophy of Jacques Derrida and the other postmodernists. Now, Ferraris, what he does is basically that he gives documents an ontological status in a kind of way that at least I have not stumbled on before. He does so in a very simple manner, actually. He identified three kinds of objects in the world. There are natural objects, there are ideal objects, and there are social objects. The natural objects, of course, mountains, rivers, clouds, whatever you want to, they are there whether we are here or not, whether we can formulate them, whether we can conceptualize them or not. Ideal objects are constructions of humans that need to be formulated to be seen. And social objects, and that is the prime target of the arguments of Ferraris, and what is interesting in our case too. Social objects is constructed by documents, and only by documents. Now that is a pretty strong assumption to make. And he makes a paraphrase on Derrida, saying there is nothing social outside the text, or there is nothing social outside of the documents. He gives documents an ontological status through an axiom where he states a social object equals an inscribed act. Social object equals an inscribed act. Now what does that mean? It means that the social object is only seen through the documents that are constituting the essence of the object. Social object, as he discusses them, also by other thinkers called, for instance, social institutions sometimes. We can take two simple examples. One of them is the marriage. Two people living together, of course, can form some kind of unity. Unity can be based on similar values or ideas about the world, or just the fact that two people like being together. But if they want to be married, we need a document. We need a marriage certificate. Without the marriage certificate, there will be no marriage. Thus, the certificate, the document, is not a result of the marriage. The document is what ontologically constitutes the marriage. The document is what makes it possible for us to study marriages. Another example, an equally simple one, is that of the national state. The national state is not anything which is actually in existence in the world as a natural object. If you choose, when you're up in Tromsø right now, if you choose to wander into the midnight sun and go somewhere southeast, you will soon enough find yourself to be in Sweden. When you do that, if you go across the mountains, there will be no sign saying now you're in Sweden. There will be no mark in the landscape. There will be no division of the clouds. There will be no thunderous voice telling you've entered Sweden. We need a document saying where this country starts and where this country ends. Thus we have constitutions, we have maps, we have legal documents, we have documentary evidence that when you pass this point, you go into another country. And that is the only way in which we can study countries. In that way, documents and documentality is given an ontological status, which is interesting for us to discuss. And just before I continue with the consequences of this for the ethical discussion, I would just mention that we can see in this situation two kinds of documents. It's not all documents. There are not all documents have the same status. Ferraris makes a difference between strong documents and weak documents, where the strong documents are the ones that are intentional, are the ones that are performative, are the ones that are ontologically defining social objects, as I mentioned. On the other hand, we also have a vast amount of other kinds of documents, which he calls weak documents. The weak documents are basically the registration of facts, which at best are potentially performative. We can think of, for instance, forensic evidence, which does not have anything in themselves that relates to certain kind of events, but in certain kinds of occasions they might just get a role or significance which may have meaning. Other examples of weak documents can be, for instance, documents found in archaeological settings, where the documents or the artifacts may have been buried and without meaning for a very long time, but when we unearth them and when we see them, we can contextualize them and put them into significance that they didn't have before. So we need to do something with these documents in order to get them, in order to make them sort of work in a performative manner. So what we're focusing here basically is in the Ferraris meaning, strong documents. Now, the documentality of professional ethics, which is of course the focus of this project. This way of looking at documents fits very well into the way in which we may reason about ethics, because ethics in this context is something defined as a social object. Ethics is nothing that exists outside the formulation, and is nothing that exists outside the formulation in documents. Ethical behavior simply can be a natural behavior which takes place in everyday life. But it becomes an ethical behavior when it's formulated as one. It becomes an ethical behavior when it's formulated in a document saying that this is good behavior, this is bad behavior. This is what we might define as an ethical way of life, an ethical view of society. This is not. That makes the documents and the documentality of ethics strong and defining and ontologically significant in the way the Ferrari discusses it. So what we have done in this project is basically that we have chosen numerous documents relating to the librarian profession, looking at how they define ethical content. And we're in the middle of the analyzing phase right now, so I will only hint certain kind of results in this talk. Perhaps I will get back next year with the final result. We'll see about that. Now what we have done is that we have tried to have a very long-term focus in this project. We have studied documents concerning librarianship and librarianship ethics that spans from 1475 up till today. In 1475, we could have taken any year in this study, of course. The reason why we chose the year 1475 is that in the European library tradition, that is one of the most significant years, because that is the year that Pope Sixtus IV wrote an edict which is the foundation of the Vatican Library. And at the same time, he initiated the first librarian, the first full-time librarian of the Vatican Library, and the Vatican Library in the modern form as we still have it. This edict is defining the role of the librarian not only in the Apostolic Library, but in a way that can be transformed into a general view of the librarian as a custodian of morally high quality documents. We then further on in time see shifts in document types discussing the ethics of librarianship. When we move on to the 17th century, we find a flood of what we might call professional handbooks. The most famous of them is the Advis pour dresser une bibliothèque by Gabriel Naudet from 1627. Now these kinds of books, and the Advis in particular, defines the role of the librarians from a professional point of view. If we have the situation with the Vatican Library, we had basically the owner of the library defining the role of the library and the role of the librarian. What does the Catholic Church want this library for? When we come to these handbooks, we see a development of the profession grasping its own fate, so to speak, in an ethical point of view, defining the role of the librarian in not only in relation to the owners of the library, which in Naudet's case was the president of Paris, the mayor of Paris, but from a professional point of view, how are we as librarians supposed to work with the collections, the building of collection, the organization of collections, the relation to users comes in here for the first time, from a professional point of view. And this is where we're sort of forming a modern kind of self-reflective librarian. And that spills over also on the ethical side, which the 17th century is a time when the librarian ethics are given a kind of autonomy in relation to the libraries that are the physical libraries. When we move on in time to the 19th century, we see the emergence of a new type of documents formulating the content of librarianship and the ethics of librarianship. We have the educational texts. For the first time, we have library schools. We have texts teaching people to become librarians and teaching people how to behave as librarians in a professional context. But not only that, if we come to the late 19th century in the US, we see that the whole idea of public librarians, for instance, as defined by Melville Dewey and others, they also incorporate a holistic ethical point of view on how to behave morally and ethically as a person, and you're only fit to be a librarian if you have certain kind of moral and ethical standards that are to be transformed and migrated into the profession. Now these texts have a huge influence on the self-image of librarians in the late 19th century and through most of the 20th century too. When we come to the late part of the 20th century, we see a fourth kind of documents defining the social object of librarianship ethics, which is the ethical codes and more or less insular position papers of professional organizations. We have American Library Association, ALA, we have IFLA, we have the European Library Association, EBLIDA. They all constitute sort of a wall between the active librarians and the surrounding society. defining the role of the libraries, both to the librarians. The librarians can look at, we can also mention UNESCO in this context. We have the Public Library Manifesto, or the School Library Manifesto of UNESCO. I know in Stockholm a good friend of mine, a librarian, who has the UNESCO Public Library Manifest put up on her wall, so that each morning when she comes into the office, she knows what to do. She has her ethical guidelines put up there for her, and finds strong comfort in this when times are tough, in the endless discussion of financing with her politicians. Now these organizations take on a role which we have not seen previously in history. They take on a role of defining not only libraries as such, but the ethical content of libraries, the free speech, which is themed around free speech, free flows of information, free flows of access to media, and somewhat equal distribution of media and information in society. These organizations, they work simultaneously into the profession and as lobby organizations in political contexts, relating to the Congress in the US, relating to the EU bureaucracy in Europe or national parliaments. So the documents defining these professions are used as tools for lobbying. They are, in other words, highly performative. Now, what we're looking at, and when we have these kinds of documents, what we're basically looking at in terms of research questions is, when we have these documents defining ethics as a social object, these documents, these various position papers, handbooks, educational texts, edicts, they are performative, strong documents defining ethics. How do their influence show? We can see at a very superficial level, almost immediately, that the role of these documents change when they appear. The handbooks of the 17th century has a different role than the papal edict. The educational texts have a new role in relation to the old handbooks, and the position papers and the ethical codes defined by today's librarianship organizations have yet another role. But how does this influence show in the content of the ethics? We don't know that yet, really, because we haven't gone deep enough in studying it, and that is what we finally intend to do in this project. Furthermore, these changes of documentality of librarianship ethics, of course, triggers one of the fundamental questions to be asked. Is there such a thing as an ethical or moral essence to librarianship? And is it through these documents, perhaps, that it's possible to reveal such an essence, if there is one? That is one thing that I'm not going to answer here and now for you. I hope to get back to this and perhaps be able to give a stronger answer to that next year, on the next year's DOCAM conference, where I indeed hope to be in person. And I hope you have a wonderful conference now, and I hope you have a wonderful evening. I saw in the program that you're heading for the Art Cathedral for a Midnight Sun concert there. I hope you have a wonderful time. And, well, if you want to comment on this or ask about this presentation, ask me things, please do that on the DOCAM list, where we can find room to have an open discussion among ourselves and on these issues. I would very much I would be very happy to get your input on this presentation. Thank you very much for listening to this, and I hope to see you next year.